Hey guys, tonight's journey takes us to a place where the world seems to float. Not on air, not on dreams, but on water. It's late evening in the Valley of Mexico, around the year 1450. The moon is rising over a wide, shallow lake called Lake Xochimilco, and the air smells faintly of mud, maize, and wet reeds. Crickets murmur between the stalks, and a few distant torches glow over the water. If you listen carefully, you can hear the soft splash of a canoe paddle. Steady, slow, like breathing. This, you realize, is not a river, not even quite a lake in the way you know it. You're floating past Chinampas, the Aztec floating gardens. Only they aren't really floating. They're small rectangular plots of land built by hand, layered with mud and reeds until they rose above the shallow lake bed. Each one is alive, filled with crops, birds, and quiet people who seem to have built a life upon the water itself. The Aztecs called them China Middle, meaning reed fences. Imagine men and women standing knee-deep in water, laying down woven mats of reeds, piling lake mud on top, planting trees at the corners to anchor the islands in place. Every handful of earth was carried from the lake bottom. Every tree was chosen carefully, willow, ahuejote, because their roots would hold the soil tight against the shifting tides. By day, these small islands were busy. Farmers moved between them by canoe, their oars slicing softly through the water. They carried maize, chili peppers, beans, and flowers. You can almost see the color, red blossoms floating over green leaves, reflections rippling softly across the lake's dark mirror. But at night, these floating gardens became still. Families rested on woven reed mats laid inside small huts built right on the Chinampas. The huts were simple, 1 or 2 rooms with low roofs and smoke-stained walls. Inside, you'd find clay pots cooling by the fire and a few sleeping mats made of straw and agave fiber. The night air was damp but comforting. You could fall asleep to the creak of wood, the lap of water against the banks, and the distant hum of frogs. The Aztecs believed that sleep connected them to the gods, especially Tlaloc, the rain god, who ruled these waters. Dreams were small visits to other worlds, brief and uncertain. A farmer who dreamt of floods might wake up early to strengthen his canal walls. A woman who dreamt of dry wind might whisper a prayer to bring back the rain. The Chinampas were more than farms. They were a breathing system, an early form of ecological engineering. The Aztecs learned how to recycle everything. Waste from the markets and homes was taken by canoe to be used as fertilizer. The canals provided fish and ducks, and even the water lilies were used to feed animals. Each island had its rhythm. Some were for maize, others for flowers, and the most beautiful ones were said to be near Xochimilco, whose name means the place of flowers. There, entire families made a living just growing flowers for ceremonies. The blooms were sold in the great marketplace of Tlatelolco, where thousands gathered every week. But here on the lake, the noise of the city faded away. At dawn, mist would curl over the water. You'd hear the first paddle strokes, the first calls of birds. People moved slowly, deliberately. Nothing hurried. Even the water seemed to move at its own ancient pace. The Aztecs built this entire system for survival. The land around the Valley of Mexico was dry, uneven, and hard to farm. But in the lake's shallows, they found balance, a way to feed hundreds of thousands of people. And perhaps unknowingly, they built one of the most sustainable farming systems in human history. If you were to drift across this watery world at night, you might see a man lying on a mat beside his canoe looking up at the stars. He's too tired to talk, his hands rough from digging mud all day. But he feels something, a quiet satisfaction that the earth, the water, and the sky are all still here, holding one another in a fragile harmony. Sometimes, when the moon was full, the reflections of the Chinampas would blur together so completely that the lake seemed to vanish, as if the gardens were truly floating. carried only by the breath of the gods. And in those still hours before dawn, when all of Tenochtitlan slept, the floating gardens were alive, half dream, half world. It's easy to forget that this quiet landscape once fed an empire. The emperor himself ate food that began here, from these small plots tended by nameless farmers. Their hands built the foundations of a civilization, one muddy basket at a time. You might wonder, how long can such a fragile system last? How many generations can sleep upon the water before the water itself changes? Because even the calmest lake in time remembers to rise. The night mist has lifted from Lake Xochimilco, and dawn has stretched a pale orange light across the still water. The farmers are already awake. Out here, rest never lasted long, not because life was harsh, but because the gardens themselves demanded attention. Every sunrise meant the same quiet cycle of work that had lasted for generations. The Chinampa wasn't just a piece of land. It was a living thing. If you left it alone too long, the lake would begin to reclaim it, gently at first, then completely. Each morning, men paddled their canoes toward the far edges of the water where the mud was thick and black. They scooped it up in woven baskets, heavy and dripping, then spread it carefully over the garden plots. That mud, rich with minerals from the lake bed, was the secret to endless fertility. Every few weeks they added another layer. Slowly, year by year, the Chinampas grew, higher, darker, more fertile. The Aztecs were master planners. Their entire society ran on order and rhythm. Every district had assigned workers, and every worker knew exactly what to do. Some were farmers, others repaired canals, cleared weeds, or tended the trees at the corners of the islands. Those trees are the ahuejotes and weren't just for beauty. Their deep roots kept the soil from washing away. Their shade protected delicate crops, and their bark was used for medicine. There was a pattern to everything. The work wasn't random or rushed. It followed the calendar of Tonalpohualli, the sacred cycle of 260 days that guided every part of Aztec life. Even the planting of maize had a ceremonial meaning, each seed placed with a small prayer to the earth. And though it might sound spiritual for most farmers, it was also deeply practical. If the canals weren't cleaned, mosquitoes bred. If the mud wasn't refreshed, the roots would rot. So they worked slowly, deliberately, repeating movements their ancestors had done long before them. It's easy to imagine the rhythm, the sound of paddles in water, the soft thump of mud falling from baskets, the murmur of people greeting one another as they passed by in canoes. Some worked in groups, trading stories, while others preferred silence. It wasn't unusual to see a farmer stop mid-task just to watch the ripples fade around his canoe, a moment of stillness in a world that never hurried. But behind this calm rhythm, there was structure, strict and unwavering. The Aztec Empire depended on tribute, and the Chinampas of Xochimilco were part of that system. Farmers owed a portion of their crops to the state. Inspectors came regularly, counting bundles of maize and chili peppers, making notes on woven cloths. It wasn't cruel, just organized. The empire relied on everyone playing their part. Those who lived on the water developed quiet expertise. They could tell by the smell of the mud whether it was rich enough for planting. They could read the direction of the wind to predict the rains. They even timed their sleep according to the moonlight. Bright nights for fishing, dark nights for rest. Women tended the household gardens, grew flowers, and cared for small livestock. The sound of weaving carried through the mornings, the rhythmic slap of the backstrap loom. Corn dough cooked on clay griddles, sending out a smell that mingled with wet earth and smoke. In this world, boredom wasn't a burden. It was balance. Every small action mattered. Every habit had meaning. Occasionally, though, the order faltered. A flood might come from Lake Texcoco, raising the water too high, washing away weeks of labor. Then the people worked double, repairing the reed fences, hauling more mud, planting again. They never gave up. The Chinampas taught patience, the kind that comes only when you understand that nature will always have the last word. As the sun climbed higher, life on the lake quickened. Children helped their parents ferry crops toward the markets. Priests performed small water ceremonies, thanking the gods for balance. Even the laughter of children seemed to echo across the canals, carried softly by the breeze. If you were to drift through one of those narrow waterways, you'd notice how peaceful it all seemed. No shouting, no clamor, just the quiet hum of people existing in harmony with their surroundings. Yet under the surface, this tranquility hid immense labor. The people of the Chinampas worked year-round with little rest. At dusk, the lake changed again. The orange sky turned silver. Farmers tied their canoes together and lit small fires for warmth. The smell of burning reeds filled the air. Dinner was simple: tamales, beans, and sometimes small fish caught in woven traps. They'd talk about the coming rains, about the emperor's new tribute demands, or about the spirits said to live beneath the lake. But mostly they spoke softly, saving their energy for the next sunrise. By nightfall, the lake turned into a mirror again. Torches reflected like stars. The Chinampas looked almost unreal, perfect rectangles of green floating on black water. The people slept lightly, listening to the sounds of the world they built: the croak of frogs, the whisper of the wind through willows, and the soft splash of a canoe drifting home. Sometimes, you might wonder if they ever tired of this endless repetition. The same work, the same mud, the same sleep upon the water. But perhaps that was their secret. The work never ended. And because of that, life never stopped. It was a balance between stillness and effort, between dreaming and doing. A rhythm the modern world has almost forgotten. But even as they worked, something was changing. The city beyond the lake, Tenochtitlan, was growing larger, hungrier. The emperor wanted more tribute, more grain, more land. And to feed that demand, the Chinampas had to stretch further than ever before, out into the deeper parts of the lake, where the water was colder and the mud was thinner. Some began to worry. Could this floating world grow forever? Or was it quietly sinking under its own perfection? The lake is still, almost too still, and the night sky hangs low, heavy with clouds. The fires on the Chinampas flicker in small orange dots across the darkness like lost lanterns on a sleeping sea. For generations, this world had survived by rhythm: mud, reed, root, water, sleep. But in the final years before the fall of Tenochtitlan, that rhythm began to tremble. It started quietly. More people, more demands, more tribute. The emperor's messengers came more often, their canoes heavier with records, their tone sharper. The farmers nodded respectfully, of course, the emperor's word was sacred. But even sacred words can strain when the land begins to tire. To feed a growing city of perhaps 200,000 souls, every inch of water was claimed. The Chinampas stretched further into the lake, where the mud was weaker and the currents stronger. People began reinforcing their islands with stones, using more trees for anchoring. But nature has its limits. At the same time, the climate shifted slightly. More rain some years, less in others. Floods tore through the canals. In dry seasons, crops wilted. To manage the imbalance, the Aztecs built dikes, long walls of stone and earth that separated fresh water from salt water. You can still picture them cutting quietly through the lake like threads of patience. But each dike, each new Chinampa, each basket of mud carried across the water, all of it required hands. And hands meant people, and people needed food, which meant more Chinampas. It was a perfect circle and a perfect trap. As the empire expanded, so did the noise of life. The once quiet waters near Xochimilco and Chalco became busy lanes of trade. Canoes filled with flowers, food and fish moved endlessly toward the great markets of Tlatelolco. You could hear the chatter, the splashing, the sound of traders calling out prices. Even at night, lights shimmered across the water as people worked late into the darkness, repairing their plots or ferrying goods to the city. But beneath all that energy was exhaustion. The lake's balance, and the one the farmers had kept for centuries, began to slip. The water turned murkier. The canals narrowed with silt. Some of the oldest chinampas began to sink, slowly, silently. The willows still stood, but their roots loosened. The mud cracked in dry seasons, then flooded in the wet. And yet even then life went on. People kept planting, kept sleeping on their reed mats, kept believing the world would stay the same. Until one night, it didn't. When the Spaniards arrived in 1519, they didn't see a fragile ecosystem. They saw a miracle. Floating fields, canals everywhere, a shining city in the middle of water. Cortés wrote in disbelief that Tenochtitlan looked like an enchanted vision, rising from the lake itself. But enchantments are delicate things. War came quietly at first, small battles, uneasy alliances. Then came fire, steel, and disease. By 1521, the city burned. The dikes broke. The carefully balanced waters flooded into the heart of Tenochtitlan. The Chinampas, the islands of life, became islands of memory. For months, people tried to repair them. Farmers still paddled out, still planted maize in the ashes of their fallen world. But the empire was gone, and with it, the system that had kept the lakes alive. The Spanish drained parts of the valley to control the floods. The water receded. The lakes shrank. The mud dried and cracked, and one by one the floating gardens sank back into the silence they were built from. Still, not everything vanished. In Xochimilco, the old canals survived, narrow, green, and slow-moving. People still grow flowers there today, and the willows still dip their roots into the water. The air smells the same, earthy, sweet, and faintly alive. If you were to visit on a quiet morning, before the tourists, before the painted boats, you could still hear it. The echo of paddles, the whisper of water, the same rhythm the Aztecs once knew. You could imagine a man from 500 years ago, still half asleep, rising from his mat to begin the day's work. He steps into his canoe. He reaches into the lake and lifts a handful of black mud, still cold, still rich. He spreads it on the soil and breathes deeply. Because the garden is alive again, it's not a grand empire anymore. It's smaller, slower, almost forgotten, but it's still there. The world that once fed millions now feeds a few families, quietly keeping its rhythm while the city around it roars. History often celebrates the builders, the conquerors, the emperors. But here, in the still waters of Xochimilco, the story belongs to the sleepers, to the people who worked, dreamed, and drifted between land and lake, never certain which one they truly belonged to. Maybe that's why the place still feels sacred, not because of temples or gold, but because of persistence. The simple act of planting and sleeping again and again, in a world that never promised to last. When you look into the black reflection of the water, it's hard to tell what's real, the sky above or its mirror below. Maybe that's what the Aztecs understood all along, that the boundary between the two is thinner than we think. So tonight, as we leave this floating world behind, let's remember that every civilization rests on something fragile, sometimes soil, sometimes faith, sometimes just the patience to keep piling mud onto reeds and hoping it holds. And as the last light fades across the water, the Chinampas seem to exhale like the world itself is ready to sleep. Somewhere, far off, a single paddle dips into the lake, a faint splash, then another. The sound repeats, steady, slow, like a heartbeat fading into silence. And for a moment, the gardens float again. It's early morning in Tlatelolco, the great marketplace of the Aztec world. The air smells faintly of dust, maize, and the smoke of morning fires. The sun is climbing over the eastern hills, touching the rooftops of Tenochtitlan with gold. You can hear it, a low, steady murmur like the sound of a distant tide. It's the sound of 10, maybe 20,000 people preparing to trade. This is not chaos. It's rhythm. The Aztecs loved order even in their markets. Every type of good had its own section. One for beans, another for salt, another for woven cloth, another for obsidian blades so sharp they could split a hair. There was a section for birds, another for vegetables, and another entirely for food vendors selling hot maize cakes and stews thick with chili and herbs. The market opened every 5 days, following the Aztec calendar's pattern of ritual and rest. It wasn't just a place of trade, it was the city's heartbeat, where time itself was measured in cycles of barter. As you walk among the stalls, the colors begin to blend. Blue-dyed cloth, red chili strings, the silver gleam of obsidian. You pass women sitting behind baskets of maize, their hands moving with quiet precision. A boy counts beans into piles, each one representing a fixed price. There's no shouting, no bargaining in the way modern markets do it. Each transaction is calm, deliberate. If you listen closely, you can hear how business was done. A greeting, a small nod, a handful of cocoa beans offered and weighed by sight. Yes, cocoa beans. They were the currency of the empire. Not gold, not silver, not coins, but small, dry, brown beans that rattled softly in bags. A few beans might buy a tomato. A handful might buy a rabbit. Hundreds could buy a cloak woven with colored feathers. The market had its judges, too. Older men seated beneath reed canopies, keeping peace and fairness. If two traders argued over price or quality, the judges would listen, decide, and move on. Their word was final. No shouting, no bribes, no disorder, just a quiet nod and a return to business. Even the noise had a kind of pattern. You could hear the traders calling the names of their goods, the murmur of footsteps on stone, the clink of ceramic jars being set down. Occasionally a bird cried from a nearby cage, or a musician played a slow tune on a reed flute. Every sound, every gesture, seemed to belong exactly where it was. This was what impressed the Spaniards most when they first saw Tlatelolco. One soldier wrote that it was the greatest market in the world, with 60,000 people gathered in perfect order, trading as if part of one vast, unbroken thought. But for the Aztecs, this wasn't extraordinary. It was simply how life worked. Trade was sacred, just like planting or prayer. To trade fairly was to honor the gods. A woman selling maize would whisper thanks to Chicomecoatl, the goddess of nourishment. A craftsman offering knives would murmur a prayer to Tonatiuh, the sun god, whose light made all things visible and thus tradable. And yet, amid all this devotion and precision, there was a kind of stillness, the slow comfort of repetition. Every 5 days the same traders came, the same goods were laid out, the same cocoa beans changed hands. The market was not about surprise. It was about continuation. If you stop walking for a moment and just stand there, you can feel it. That deep, slow rhythm of life. The smell of roasted maize. The flicker of sunlight on ceramic jars. The rustle of woven reed mats as sellers rearrange their goods. A young man at a stall measures salt into a gourd. His movements so practiced, they seem like part of a dance. He doesn't rush. He doesn't pause. Just the same motion again and again, and beside him an old woman arranges chilies into small pyramids. Red, green, yellow. The same shape she's made every market day for 40 years. To her, the market isn't exciting. It's familiar, predictable, but that's the beauty of it. In predictability lies peace. Behind all of this order was an invisible system of trust. Each district of Tenochtitlan had its own traders who specialized in one kind of good. Some brought obsidian from the mountains. Some brought fish from the lake. Others brought cotton from faraway valleys. Every good was traced back to its region. Nothing was wasted and nothing was lost. And while the emperor ruled from his palace, it was this quiet, collective rhythm that truly kept the empire alive. Without the farmers, the traders, the market judges, the bean counters, the empire would have starved not from hunger, but from imbalance. As the sun rises higher, the market grows warm. The smell of earth and maize deepens. A small group of young men arrives carrying cages of colorful birds. They set them down, open one, and the flutter of wings fills the air. The sound is bright but brief, gone as soon as it came. You realize, standing there, that this entire market breathes like one living thing. It inhales with trade, exhales with rest. It wakes with the city and sleeps with the sun. And in its rhythm, there's something deeply human. The endless repetition that builds civilizations. The quiet boredom that sustains greatness. By midday, the crowd begins to thin. Some traders pack their baskets. Others linger, sharing small bowls of atoll, a warm maize drink. People talk about the next market day, about prices, about rain. No one seems hurried. The world outside the marketplace might rise and fall, but here, time moves in circles. And as the shadows lengthen and the air cools, you can almost imagine the market folding back into silence, the same way it has for centuries. Tomorrow, the plaza will be empty again, but in 5 days the voices will return, the beans will clink, and the rhythm will begin once more. It's strange, isn't it? How much of civilization depends on remembering to show up, to count the beans, to measure the salt, and to do it all over again. You might wonder, in a world so alive with trade and motion, did anyone ever stop to ask what it all added up to? Or were they, like us, too busy keeping the rhythm of their own quiet market day? The sun is rising higher above Lake Texcoco, and the city of Tlatelolco hums softly beneath it. The market is open again, and from every canal, canoes arrive one after another. Their paddlers moving in perfect rhythm, not hurried, not lazy, just steady. Each canoe carries goods from across the Aztec world. Some come from the warm, humid south, where cacao and cotton grow. Others arrive from the cold, rocky highlands, loaded with obsidian, salt, and feathers. Every journey is long, every route familiar, and all of them, every single trader, farmer, and boatman, will pass through this market. It's hard to imagine now, but Tlatelolco was more than a marketplace. It was the heart of the empire's economy, the invisible pulse that kept the Aztec world alive. From it, goods spread outward like ripples on the surface of the lake. The people who ran this network weren't nobles or priests. They were Posteca, merchants. Calm, quiet, deliberate. In the Aztec hierarchy, they lived between the warriors and the common people, respected but not exalted. Yet in many ways, they were the empire's lifeblood. The Posteca traveled far beyond the Valley of Mexico and through jungles, deserts, and mountains. They brought back salt, honey, cotton, rubber, and jade. They carried the empire's language and tribute system to distant places. And when they returned, their canoes glided silently into the canals of Tlatelolco, their goods unloaded, counted, and stacked neatly before sunrise. Every market day was an act of renewal. The Posteca didn't just bring goods. They brought stories, quiet exchanges of geography and gossip, of alliances and whispers. Through them, the emperor learned what other cities were doing, who was growing stronger, who was restless. In that way, trade became information, and information became power. But none of this seemed grand when you were standing inside the market. It was all so ordinary, so peaceful. The same repetition of motion, the same small gestures that made the whole world move. If you watched closely, you'd see how perfectly balanced it all was. Each region's product had its place in the web. Maize from the Lake Islands, cacao from the southern valleys, salt from the highlands, cotton cloth from the warm coasts, obsidian blades from the volcanic mountains, every thread wove into another. And the market was the loom that held them all together. There were no coins, no paper, no accounts written in ink. The Aztecs recorded trade with memory, with ritual, and with trust. Prices were remembered by the community. If someone tried to cheat, everyone would know. Inspectors walked the aisles, making sure weights were fair, goods clean, and prices honest. There were laws for everything. How to measure salt, how to store beans, how to display cloth. Even the placement of your stall was part of the order, assigned by district and lineage. To modernize, it might seem restrictive, but to them it was safety, a world that made sense. For the Pochteca, travel was not only business. It was ceremony. Before leaving for a journey, they prayed to Yaxcatecutli, the god of merchants, whose name means the Lord who guides. They tied their goods together with knotted cords, a symbolic gesture of unity, and set out quietly, sometimes disappearing for months. When they returned, the city celebrated them. Not with parades, but with silence. A day of rest, offerings, and gratitude. It's strange, isn't it? That an empire known for conquest and blood also rested upon the quiet, repetitive work of trade. That beneath the drums and spears, the Aztecs were accountants of beans and feathers. But it worked. Through the market, tribute flowed in and out like the tides. The emperor collected what each province owed. Maize, cloth, jade, gold, and even live animals. Those goods passed through Tlatelolco, sorted and redistributed with astonishing precision. Every transaction left no waste, no confusion, and as the system grew, the people adapted. Children learned to count in cocoa beans. Women knew exactly how many maize cakes to trade for a pot of stew. Entire families built their lives around the rhythm of the market. 5 days of preparation, 1 day of exchange, and 5 more to begin again. When the Spanish first walked into this world, they were stunned by its scale. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortez's soldiers, wrote, "There were so many people and so much order that I was astounded. No one raised their voice. Every good had its place and every seller knew his measure. To them, it felt unreal, as if civilization had formed here by accident, floating on an inland sea. But to the Aztecs, it was simply the result of patience. The patience to count beans, the patience to measure salt, the patience to keep doing small things well, even when no one noticed." As afternoon settles, the sun turns warm and golden over the plaza. The smell of roasted maize fades into the air. Shadows stretch long across the stones. You see the judges gathering their mats, the traders packing their baskets, the last buyers making quiet exchanges before dusk. And then, for a brief moment, the noise stops. You can almost hear the last cocoa bean drop into a pouch. A soft, hollow sound that marks the end of another market day. Tomorrow the plaza will be silent again. The wind will blow dust across the stones, and only the footprints of thousands will remain. But the memory of the rhythm lingers, steady, circular, endless. You realize now, this marketplace wasn't just commerce. It was memory, ritual, and order all woven into one. The people of Tlatelolco didn't build temples to trade. They built trade into their lives. A quiet faith in balance, in repetition, in showing up. And maybe that's what truly moved the empire. Not battles, not kings, but a marketplace where everything and everyone kept to time. But when time itself is circular, always beginning again, what happens when someone breaks the rhythm? What happens when silence enters the marketplace, not from rest, but from ruin? Mist drifts low over Lake Texcoco, and the first light glints off the canoes sliding toward the city. Traders rise before dawn, brushing sleep from their eyes, arranging their goods with quiet precision. The market is opening or it's supposed to. But something is different today. There's a smell in the air that doesn't belong here. Smoke, faint but sharp. And beneath the ordinary murmur of the plaza, a deeper sound carries through the air, the distant thud of drums. At first, no one stops. The Pochteca keep unloading their baskets. Women keep stacking maize cakes. The inspectors make their rounds as always. Order must continue. That's what they believe. The rhythm must not break, but the sound of the drums grows closer. Then come shouts, the ringing of metal, the echo of a voice not speaking Nahuatl. The people turn their heads toward the western edge of the city, and that's when they see it. The smoke rising from Tenochtitlan, their sister city. The Spaniards have come. The marketplace of Tlatelolco, once the center of the Aztec world, becomes something else entirely, a battlefield. The people who once traded cacao and maize now fight for their lives among the same stalls. The stone plaza that held so much order and fairness now fills with panic. Historians later call it the fall of Tlatelolco. But the truth is quieter, more tragic in its stillness. The merchants, the sellers, the mothers clutching their children, they don't think about history. They think about home, about continuing, about keeping the rhythm. But the rhythm is gone. Cortez soldiers advance through the streets with weapons no one here has ever seen. Firearms crack in the air. The stone temples tremble. And the sound of war echoes through canals that once carried nothing more dangerous than floating maize and flowers. Smoke darkens the sky. Somewhere, a Pochteca hides his ledgers and balances beneath a mat, as if tomorrow the market might open again. It never does. Days later, silence returns, but it's not the peaceful kind. The air is still heavy, full of ash. The lake reflects nothing but gray clouds. When the Spaniards finally stand in the empty plaza of Tlatelolco, they are surrounded by the ghosts of an order they cannot understand. To them, this was victory, the end of the Aztec Empire. But to the people who once counted beans and feathers, it is simply the loss of balance. No one is keeping track anymore. No one is weighing salt or measuring maize. The market that once moved the empire is gone, and yet something of it remains. The canals still remember the paddles. The stones still remember the footsteps. The air still carries the faint scent of roasted maize when the sun hits just right. History doesn't always vanish. It fades softly, like sound underwater. And perhaps that's the strangest part, that the empire which conquered half of Mesoamerica didn't truly fall with a sword, but with silence, and the silence of a market that forgot its rhythm. Centuries pass. The lake dries. The cities become one, Mexico City. And if you walk today through the northern district, past the noise of traffic and street, vendors shouting prices, you might find yourself standing where the old market once was. There's a plaza. They're still called Tlatelolco, paved with stone. Children play where the Pochteca once stood. Vendors still sell maize and flowers, their calls mixing with the hum of buses and radios. Life continues. But if you pause, really pause, and let the noise fade, you might hear something else beneath it. A quieter rhythm, still beating. Not the rhythm of empire or conquest, but of repetition. Of people who, even after everything, kept showing up to trade, to talk, to remember. Because maybe that's what civilizations really are. Not monuments or kings, but marketplaces. places where people meet, exchange, and begin again. And in that way, the Aztec market never truly disappeared. It just kept trading in silence. Beneath the grand temples and towering pyramids of Tenochtitlan, a quieter world existed, one most people never saw. Down there, below the plazas where dancers spun and priests prayed, men and women worked in the half-light of tunnels waist-deep in mud, their hands steady, their movements slow and deliberate. They were the engineers, though no one called them that at the time. They were simply workers, builders, stonecutters, and diggers. But what they built kept the great city alive. Tenochtitlan was not an easy place to live. It was a city floating on a lake, a network of islands, canals, and causeways. Every brick, every street, every temple was part of a balancing act between land and water. And the Aztecs, with a calm that comes only from long observation, learned to make that balance work. When most people think of ancient empires, they imagine walls and armies. But in this city, power was measured in drainage channels and sluice gates. A simple wooden valve, adjusted by hand, could mean the difference between abundance and flood. At dawn, before the city stirred, the engineers would gather at the edges of the canals. They checked the flow, how high the water had risen overnight, how the wind pushed it, how the reeds swayed. They would note it quietly, using stones or sticks as markers. No writing was needed. The rhythm of the lake told its own story. The great dikes that protected the city were their pride. Massive embankments of clay, stone, and reed, the Albaradon of Nezahualcóyotl being the most famous, stretched for miles across the water. It divided fresh water from salt and kept the fragile equilibrium of the lake alive. Each stone in that dike had been carried by hand or canoe. Each layer had been placed by someone who understood the quiet weight of mud. It was not glorious work. It was slow, methodical, repetitive, the kind of work that left no name in history. But without it, the temples above would have crumbled, the markets would have drowned, and the empire itself would have washed away. The engineers' day began before sunrise and ended after dark. They lived by cycles of water. When the rains came, they listened. You can imagine them, a group of men and women standing knee-deep in rising water, feeling the current against their skin. They would adjust the flow by opening or closing the wooden gates that cut through the dike, allowing the water to breathe. To an outsider, it would look like nothing more than mud and wood. But to them, it was life, a fragile, pulsing network. The city's leaders rarely came to the dikes. They saw only the gleam of the temples, not the slow labor beneath. But every time a storm passed without flooding the sacred precinct, the engineers' quiet precision had been the reason why. And yet, they were never celebrated. When the emperor spoke to the gods, it was atop the temple. When the priest offered flowers to the rain deity Tlaloc, it was on the pyramids. But down below, the engineers were the ones who actually spoke to the water, not with prayers, but with balance and care. They learned to read the signs of the lake as others read omens in the stars. A shift in the color of the water meant silt rising. A sudden calm meant wind on the far shore. A ripple pattern could predict where the next flood would come. And when they built the temples, they did not simply pile stone upon stone. They designed foundations that could float, layers of volcanic rock, sand and timber mats that distributed the weight evenly, allowing the massive pyramids to rest lightly on soft ground. Imagine that. An entire civilization resting on the work of those unseen hands. When earthquakes trembled, when rain poured, when the wind howled across the lake, the city still stood, not because of magic or gods, but because of calculation, patience, and the quiet art of engineering. By midday, the tunnels beneath the temples would grow hot and close. The air was thick with moisture. Workers passed buckets of clay, whispered measurements, tested pressure with reeds. The city above hummed with ritual, drums, chants, the sound of sandals against stone. But below, only the drip of water echoed. There was a strange peace down there, the kind of calm that comes when you work with something you understand completely. They knew the lake like a friend. They could feel when it was restless, when it was content, when it needed relief. To most people, water was something to fear, a force that could drown crops and topple walls. To the Aztec engineers, it was a companion. They built with it, not against it. Centuries later, when Spanish chroniclers wrote about Tenochtitlan, they marveled at its beauty, the shining canals, the symmetrical causeways, the reflections of temples in the water, but they rarely mentioned the engineers, the calm minds who measured, calculated, adjusted, who spent their lives beneath the temples, ensuring that what was glorious above would not collapse below. Perhaps it's fitting. Their work was never meant to be seen. It was meant to hold. And maybe that's the lesson hidden in the mud and stone of the story. That greatness often depends on the quietest people. Those who work unseen, without praise, without history remembering their names, yet whose calm persistence keeps everything standing. If you could walk through those tunnels now, under the ruins that still rest beneath Mexico City, you might still feel that stillness. The air is different down there, heavy but calm, like the breath of a city that still remembers how to float. The sound fades, slow drops of water, then silence. And perhaps the question left behind is this: when the temples have long crumbled, what remains in the stones above or the calm beneath them? Water is patient. It waits. That was something every Aztec engineer knew. While warriors trained for battle and priests studied the heavens, the engineers studied the quiet pull of gravity, the angle of a current, the way a single misplaced stone could undo months of work. The city of Tenochtitlan was not simply built on water, it was built with it. The engineers understood that the lake had moods, like a living creature, calm and mirror smooth at dawn, restless and swollen by dusk. So they learned how to listen. Each year, the rains tested them. When the clouds rolled over the valley, dark and heavy, the sound of distant thunder reached the city long before the first drops fell. The engineers knew it meant one thing: the work begins again. Flooding was always the enemy, not sudden, not violent, but slow and certain. So they went out in their canoes, carrying wooden poles and reed ropes, marking depths and measuring the rise of the water. It wasn't a grand sight. No ceremonies, no speeches. Just men and women paddling silently through gray rain, counting heartbeats between waves. They checked the Alberadones, the great dikes of the valley. Some were miles long, built from layers of volcanic stone, clay, and brushwood, all pressed together into walls strong enough to divide entire lakes. To the untrained eye, they looked like simple embankments, but to the Aztec engineers, every layer held meaning. The weight of each stone balanced perfectly to allow water to seep slowly through, rather than burst through all at once. Too tight and pressure would build. Too loose, and the lake would win. That delicate balance was their entire craft. The most famous of these works was the Alberadon of Nezahualcoyotl, named after the philosopher king of Texcoco, who designed it himself alongside his engineers. It stretched more than 12 kilometers, separating the brackish saltwater of the eastern lake from the freshwater around Tenochtitlan. Without it, crops would die, drinking water would sour, and the floating gardens and the chinampas would wither. It was, in every sense, the artery of the empire, and like all great arteries, it required constant care. The engineers worked in small teams. One would measure, another would patch leaks with clay, another would carve small channels to redirect flow. When the rains were heavy, they would stay awake for nights at a time, checking the dikes by torchlight. They had no modern tools, no iron instruments, no wheels. What they had was observation. Centuries of accumulated knowledge passed down from the builders of earlier lakeshore peoples, like the Tepanecs and Acoluas. It was a science of touch and sound. A hollow echo beneath a reed meant water pressure building. A trembling stone meant the base was shifting. A single trickle of water through a crack could become a flood by dawn, and yet they kept calm. Theirs was not the panic of people fighting nature. It was the quiet patience of people working with it. When the Emperor Moctezuma ordered new causeways to link Tenochtitlan with the mainland, the engineers were called again. 3 long stone roads, and to Tacuba, Tepeyac and Iztapalapa stretched across the lake. But these weren't just walkways. They were masterpieces of controlled water flow. Each causeway had small openings, adjustable gates that allowed canoes to pass and water to circulate, preventing stagnation. During the day, traders used them. At night, the engineers walked them, checking the sound of water lapping against the supports. It was said that when the city slept, the only ones awake were the guards and the engineers. And while the guards protected the city from enemies above the water, the engineers guarded it from the enemies below. Sometimes, the lake would remind them who was in charge. One summer, the rains came harder than anyone remembered. Water rose higher each day, creeping into the lowest streets. The engineers worked without rest, hauling mud, shoring up dikes, digging temporary drains. But the lake didn't stop. When the first temple steps flooded, people began to panic. The priests offered sacrifices. The nobles sent runners to summon help. But down at the water's edge, the engineers didn't pray. They adjusted. They opened the dike gates, redirected the overflow toward the northern swamps, and cut new canals to spread the water evenly. By morning, the lake had stabilized. When Moctezuma came to inspect, the waters were already receding. He gave thanks to the gods. The engineers said nothing. Their calm was their strength. They knew that what they did was invisible when it worked and unforgettable only when it failed. No songs were written about the men who measured mud with sticks or who hauled baskets of clay through the rain. But if they stopped, for even one season, the temples above would tilt, the markets would drown, and the empire would crumble. In that way, they were the quiet backbone of everything sacred and powerful. By the late 15th century, Tenochtitlan was at its height. The canals gleamed in the sunlight. The air was sweet with flowers, and the water mirrored the temples like a second sky. Foreign visitors called it the Venice of the New World. But long before that comparison was made, the Aztec engineers already knew what it meant to live in partnership with water, to respect its patience and its power. They had built not a city on land, but a city with water, a delicate balance, held together by unseen hands. When the night fell after each long day, the engineers would sit by the lake. The air would be cool, the surface of the water flat as polished stone. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. They would watch the moon ripple across the canal, listen to the frogs, and feel the damp earth beneath them. It was the same stillness that had guided them for generations, and perhaps they wondered, though none ever said it aloud, how long the lake would let them stay. There was no storm that day. The lake was still. The air was heavy and warm, the kind of air that makes sound travel far. The engineers stood by the causeways watching small ripples move across the surface. They had heard rumors. Strangers with beards and metal clothing had arrived on the coast bringing thunder and horses. But the lake gave no sign of danger. And for people who had trusted water their entire lives, silence often meant safety. Still, they checked the dikes that morning, as they always did. They tested the gates, measured the depths, balanced the flow. The empire depended on this quiet work, even as whispers of war reached the capital. When the Spaniards entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, they saw a miracle of engineering. The canals, the bridges, the causeways, and all of it, built with such precision that their horses' hooves echoed softly on the stone. The Spanish chronicler, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, would later write that the city seemed to rise from the water as if it were enchanted, and perhaps it was, because every temple, every shining surface, every reflection of sunlight on the lake existed only because of the calm persistence of those who had worked beneath the temples. The Spaniards didn't understand that. They saw glory where the engineers saw balance. They saw gold and conquest where the builders saw mud and patience. The first flood of change came not from the sky, but from the streets. After Moctezuma's capture, chaos rippled through the canals. The water gates were sealed for defense. The dikes were left unattended, and the engineers, and the ones who had always known how to calm the lake, were sent instead to dig trenches, move stones, and build barricades for battle. The rhythm was broken. The water had no one to listen to it anymore. Days later, the rains began again. Heavy, unrelenting rain. The canals overflowed, turning streets into rivers. Storage houses flooded. Canoes drifted loose. It was as if the lake itself was mourning the loss of its caretakers. Then came La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. The Spaniards, trying to escape the uprising, fled across the western causeway. In the darkness, the lake swallowed them. Bridges broke, canoes capsized. Soldiers drowned beneath the same water they had once called beautiful. The engineers who had built those causeways might have recognized the irony. The lake defending itself. The balance restored for a moment by chaos, but the calm would not last. A year later, Cortés returned with allies and siege weapons. This time he didn't just fight the Aztec warriors. He fought the city itself. He ordered the canals filled with rubble, the aqueducts cut, the dikes destroyed. The water that had once been carefully guided now turned against its makers. The engineers tried to repair the damage in secret. They dug at night, opened hidden sluices, tried to redirect floods away from the last surviving gardens. But every day new trenches appeared. New channels were broken. The lake began to rise uncontrollably. Houses flooded. Floating gardens tore loose from their moorings. The temples, once perfectly balanced, began to sink unevenly. And so the calm beneath the temple gave way to collapse. The engineers stood helpless as the structures they had tended for generations slowly drowned. They were not warriors. They did not know how to fight men with steel and fire. Their battle had always been with water, a force they understood. But this was a different kind of flood, one that could not be measured with sticks or balanced with clay. When the siege ended, when the fires went out and the city fell, Tenochtitlan was no longer a city of water. It was a ruin. The canals were clogged with debris. The causeways broken. The great dike of Nezahualcóyotl, once the pride of the valley, stood shattered in silence. And yet, even then, the engineers did not stop. The surviving Aztec builders, now forced to work under Spanish command, began again. They dredged the lake, rebuilt the causeways, and tried to drain what the conquerors feared. To the Spaniards, water was a nuisance to be eliminated. To the engineers, it was still life. They were ordered to dry the lake, to turn the valley into land for streets and churches. So, they obeyed. But deep down, they must have known what that would mean. Each new canal diverted, each old gate sealed, each dike removed. Slowly, the lake began to die, and with it, the calm beneath the temple faded into history. Centuries later, the valley would be dry. The great city of Mexico would rise on its bones, heavy, unsteady, sinking still, as if the earth remembered the water that once carried it. Engineers today still struggle with that legacy. The ground shifts, the buildings tilt, the rain still tries to find its old paths. Every year water returned, water rising through cracks, flooding streets, as if reminding the city that balance once lost must always be paid for. No one remembers the names of those first Aztec engineers, but if you walk through the old quarter after rain, when puddles gather in the cobblestones and the air smells faintly of wet earth, you can still feel their presence. You can almost imagine them, silent figures in the dark, listening to the heartbeat of the ground, measuring, adjusting, keeping watch. They are still there, beneath the city, beneath the noise, holding back the water, still calm, still unseen, still working. Before the first rays of light touched the lake, before the drums of the temple began to sound, the fire was already awake. It lived quietly in the center of the house, a low red glow breathing beneath 3 black stones. Around it, the kitchen began to stir. The woman of the house, like so many others in Tenochtitlan, moved in silence. She had no need for words yet. The day began not with talk, but with work. Grinding, mixing, listening. The first sound of the city each morning was not the priest's chant or the call of merchants. It was the low, rhythmic scrape of matat stones, hundreds of them all across the city. The sound of maize being ground into life. Each family had its own fire pit, the hearth, tended by women who guarded it as carefully as the priests guarded their temples. It was said that the household fire was a gift from the goddess Chantico, protector of home and warmth. If the fire went out, the family's fortune could fade with it. So before dawn every morning the women fed it. Bits of wood, a handful of dry reeds, sometimes a little maize husk. Then, kneeling by the fire, they began to prepare the dough, masa. Corn soaked in lime water overnight, softened and pale, ground slowly on the metate until it became smooth and heavy, almost breathing with warmth. This was not just cooking, it was a kind of daily offering. In a city as vast as Tenochtitlan, a place of canals and floating gardens, food was a rhythm of its own. Each morning, traders brought baskets of amaranth, beans, tomatoes, and chili peppers to the markets. Fishermen arrived in their canoes with piles of shimmering fish. Farmers from the Chinampas carried bundles of greens still wet from the lake. And in thousands of kitchens, women turned those ingredients into the meals that fed an empire. Their kitchens were small, 1 room, sometimes 2, with smoke-blackened walls and clay pots hanging from wooden racks. Yet within those walls, entire systems of knowledge lived. Recipes, techniques, rituals passed from mother to daughter for generations. No written books, no records, only hands remembering what words forgot. They cooked on kamals, flat clay griddles balanced on 3 stones. On them tortillas puffed and darkened in the heat. A dozen might be made before sunrise, then another dozen for the midday meal. The work never stopped. Nearby, a pot of beans simmered slowly, flavored with salt and epazote leaves. Another pot might hold a tole, a thin maize drink for children and elders. There was little meat, perhaps a handful of insects, or a bit of roasted fish if it had been a good day. But the meals were full of warmth and care, and that made them sacred in their own quiet way. Outside, the city began to wake. The sound of paddles on the canal, the faint call of the priest greeting the rising sun. the laughter of children, still half asleep, chasing one another through the mist. But in the kitchen, time moved differently. The woman turned each tortilla by hand, feeling for heat, watching for bubbles. Her daughter fetched water. Her son fanned the fire. It was a small world, but one built on endless repetition. The same gestures, the same smells, the same patience. And yet, this repetition was the backbone of the empire. Because no warrior, no priest, no noble could stand in the temple or march to war without the work that began here, in the kitchens before dawn. Sometimes the women would pause and look toward the east, where the temple rose above the mist. They would see the first smoke of sacrifice curling into the sky, a prayer offered to the gods. And perhaps they wondered if their own smoke, rising from the hearth, carried its own kind of prayer. After all, what was the difference between the priest burning incense for the gods and the mother roasting maize for her children? Both gave something to sustain life. Both served warmth to something greater than themselves. As the sun climbed higher, the air filled with the smell of cooked maize, roasted chilies, and damp earth. The markets began to stir. The distant sound of traders calling prices floated through the canals. The women cleaned their metates, fed the fire again, and began preparing for the midday meal. It was the same every day. And yet, in that sameness, there was peace. A kind of order that matched the rhythm of the city itself. Predictable, balanced, necessary. By noon, the house would be warm and smoky. The children would nap in the corner. The man of the house, a laborer or craftsman, would return briefly for food before going back to work. And when the meal was over, when the bowls were cleaned and the fire quieted to coals, the woman would rest and went for a while. Then she would grind again. The sound of the metate never really stopped. It was the heartbeat of the empire, the soft, patient sound that built a world one tortilla at a time. Years later, when the empire fell and the temples burned, that sound remained. Even when the Spanish banned the old gods and tore down the pyramids, the kitchen stayed alive. The fire still burned each morning. The women still rose before dawn, grinding maize, feeding their families, keeping the rhythm. Perhaps that was the real endurance of the Aztec world. Not the stones, not the ceremonies, but the quiet persistence of ordinary hands keeping life warm. By mid-morning, the heart of Tenochtitlan pulsed not from the temples above, but from the ground below, the markets. The city's great market, Tlatelolco, was a sea of sound and movement. You could smell it long before you saw it. Roasted maize, damp flowers, salted fish, and the faint sweetness of honey. Every path, every canal, led there eventually. For the woman of the kitchen, this was not a place of excitement or spectacle. It was the necessary turn of the day, the continuation of her morning labor. She carried a woven basket on her hip, steady and familiar. In it, the remains of yesterday's maize cakes, perhaps a few dried chilies for barter, and a small handful of cacao beans. Her currency. The market awaited her. The first thing she saw were the smoke columns, thin trails rising from hundreds of cook fires as vendors roasted seeds, warmed tamales, or burned copal for the gods of trade. There were no permanent stalls, only reed mats laid on the ground. Vendors sat cross-legged beside their goods, their wares spread like quiet offerings, baskets of green herbs still wet from the chinampas. Strands of red and yellow chilies sharp in the sunlight. High rows of fish, silvery and still, caught from the lake at dawn. Clay jars filled with pulque, the sour drink of the maguey plant. Feathers, obsidian blades, and simple wooden bowls. But what drew her eye most were the small pyramids of maize. the foundation of her life. Yellow, white, red, and even blue. Each type had a story, a purpose, a flavor. She knew the difference by touch. Barter was a soft art, part negotiation, part ritual. A few cacao beans passed between fingers. A handful of maize weighed in the palm. A nod, a pause. A trade, the woman bought what she needed. A small gourd of salt from the coast. A bundle of onions. A piece of smoked fish wrapped in a leaf. She paid not with coin but with work. Maize cakes baked at dawn traded for whatever she lacked. Money was not yet a solid thing in this world. Value moved through hands and trust. Everywhere there was sound, but none of it rushed. The hum of quiet talking, the clatter of pottery, the soft thump of feet on the packed earth. It was life at a gentle pace, measured not in minutes but in meals. Children ran between the stalls carrying baskets. Old men sat near the canal's edge carving new paddles. Dogs wandered hopefully between vendors, noses lifted toward the smell of roasting corn. And through it all, smoke curled and drifted upward, the same smoke that rose from her own hearth that morning. It connected everything. From home to market, from meal to ceremony. Near the center of the square, a priest stood beside a small altar of flowers and incense. He murmured blessings for fair trade, for honest measure, for abundance. Some women paused to bow their heads before buying. Others simply glanced, respectful but practical. The gods were everywhere, even in the work of their hands. Our woman lingered a moment longer. She thought of Chicomecoatl, the maize goddess, the one who gave sustenance but demanded balance. Take too much and the fields could dry. Forget to give thanks and the corn could rot before harvest. Her offering that day was simple, a single ear of maize, wrapped in husk, placed gently before the flowers. She whispered nothing, but her breath was enough. When her basket was full, she began the slow walk home. The air shimmered with sunlight now. The lake sparkled. Men in canoes paddled between islands carrying loads of soil and reeds. Women in other boats sang softly as they returned from the market, their songs rising and falling with the splash of water. It was a calm, predictable world, but not without precision. The city functioned like a living clock. Every person from priest to fisher had a rhythm, and hers was one of the oldest and steadiest of all. Back at home, the kitchen fire had dimmed to embers. She knelt beside it, coaxing it back to life. A handful of reeds, a small breath of air, a whisper. Flame bloomed again, golden and alive. Her daughter returned with a small jug of lake water. Together they began the midday preparations. Beans reheated, maize dough shaped again, chilies ground into a soft red paste. The kitchen filled with the low hum of conversation about the market, the weather, and a neighbor's new baby. No great stories, no wars or kings, just the simple weaving of ordinary life, a kind of history that never made it into the codices. When the meal was ready, she served it carefully. Tortillas stacked like thin pages, beans smooth and dark, a bit of fish on the side. The smell was rich and quiet, the scent of contentment. As her family ate, she wiped the metate clean, her hands moving in circles as if drawing the sun itself back to rest. Every act, grinding, cooking, serving, and had meaning beyond its surface. It was rhythm. It was order. It was the same pattern that built the empire's temples and guided its calendars. The home was the mirror of the cosmos, small, smoky, alive. In the afternoon, she sat by the doorway with her daughter, weaving a small mat from reeds. The lake breeze carried faint sounds of the city, drums, paddles, laughter. The day stretched quietly forward. Time, for her, was not about years or rains. It was measured in fires tended, in meals cooked, in seasons of rain and sun. And though her name would never be written in any surviving record, her work fed the people who built the temples, paddled the canals, and shaped an empire of floating gardens. When the strangers came, pale-skinned, armored, carrying thunder, the fires did not go out right away. In the grand temples, yes, the flames of the gods were extinguished, replaced by the smoke of gunpowder and grief. But in the kitchens, in the small homes scattered across the lake's islands, the hearth still glowed. The woman rose before dawn, as she always had. The difference now was the silence outside. No temple drums, no calls from the market priests, no morning chant to the rising sun. Only the faint splash of paddles on the water, slower now. Only the crackle of her fire. She didn't know yet what this new world would mean. But she knew one thing with certainty. People still needed to eat. She began, as always, with maize, soaked overnight, soft and pale. Ground slowly, her hands moving in rhythm, though her mind wandered further than before. The matat was smooth from years of use, a piece of stone that had seen her children grow, her husband age, her city change. Each grain she ground was a memory, a heartbeat. Each motion carried a stubborn defiance, a quiet promise that life would continue, even as the world turned upside down. Outside, men with new voices and strange clothes walked through the markets that survived. They brought animals no one had seen before, horses, pigs, cows, and with them came smells that didn't belong to the lake or the maize fields. They spoke words that twisted the air differently. Their god had a single face. Their crosses rose where temples once stood, but the kitchens in those small smoky sanctuaries were harder to conquer. Because how do you conquer the act of feeding? How do you erase something so ordinary, so necessary, so human? Soon these foreigners began to taste what they did not understand. They chewed maize cakes and called them tortillas. They drank warm atole on cold mornings. They dipped bread in chili sauces, eyes watering from heat they could not tame. Without meaning to, they learned the rhythm of this land, one bite at a time, and slowly, almost invisibly, the kitchens became bridges between worlds. Our woman, older now, her hair streaked with gray, watched her daughter cook with a mixture of old and new. Maize still formed the center of every meal. But now pieces of pork appeared in the pot, new herbs mixed with the old ones. The smell of smoke carried something unfamiliar, yet familiar all the same. She did not fight the change. She only adjusted the flame, as she always had, to keep it burning steady. In time, the old city disappeared beneath layers of new stone. Church bells replaced the drums. Markets changed names. But in the courtyards, the same round komals still glowed. The matat still sang its soft, grinding song each dawn. And women, like her, continued to feed families with the same patience their mothers had taught them. A line of care stretching backward through centuries. History would remember the conquerors, the priests, the battles. But the real continuity of the world, the thread that tied the before and after, lived in the kitchens. The fire, once sacred to Chantico, now burned quietly beneath crosses. No one spoke her name anymore, yet the women still fed the flame the same way, whispering small thanks into the smoke. They still shaped the maize between their palms, pressing and turning, the same gesture repeated 1,000 times. 1,000 mornings. It was not rebellion. It was endurance, a gentle resistance made of warmth and nourishment. Generations passed. The Spanish cities grew, but in the back rooms, kitchens remained their own worlds, half old, half new. The descendants of the woman still rose before dawn. They still ground the maize, still tended the fire, still carried the rhythm of their ancestors in their hands. In every tortilla flipped, in every pot of beans stirred, in every flame tended, the old gods whispered, unnamed but alive. Now centuries later, if you walk through Mexico City before sunrise, you can still hear it. Faint, rhythmic, familiar, that same sound of stone on maize. The same song of survival, vendors setting up their stalls, street cooks warming the first tortillas of the day. A thin line of smoke rising through the cool air. Most people don't notice it anymore, but if you listen carefully, if you stand very still, it's there. The sound of a civilization that refused to vanish. The sound of ordinary women who fed empires, conquerors and children alike. The fire that once belonged to the Aztec hearth still burns, changed in form, not in spirit. It no longer belongs to gods or kings. It belongs to the hands that grind, stir, and serve, the hands that never stopped, even when history did. Perhaps this is how civilizations truly survive, not through their monuments or their conquests, but through their quiet, repetitive acts of care. Every meal cooked, every fire tended, every grain of maize ground by tired hands is a small defiance against forgetting. And so, in the warmth of a kitchen before dawn, the Aztec world still lives, not as ruins, but as rhythm. It began, as it always did, with a column of smoke. Thin at first, a faint gray thread rising from the mountain's crown. Then thicker, darker, curling into the pale morning sky. From the great city of Tenochtitlan, the people could see it even across the wide valley. Popocatépetl, the smoking mountain. The living volcano. The Aztecs called it Popocatépetl, the hill that smokes. To them, it was not a threat. It was a presence, ancient, patient, and holy. They told stories that it was a sleeping warrior, lying beside his beloved Iztaccíhuatl, the white woman, whose snowy slopes rested in eternal stillness. When the mountain smoked, it was said he was dreaming, remembering battles long past or sighing in his sleep. But for others, especially those who lived closer to its shadow, the smoke was more than myth. It was a warning. Every few years, when the tremors deepened, the villagers at the mountain's foot would watch their fields carefully. The earth would pulse beneath their feet, a slow, steady heartbeat. Springs would bubble differently. Birds would fly lower. Even the dogs would bark without reason. Uneasy, and still life went on. Because for them, the mountain's moods were part of the rhythm of the world. Like rain, like drought, like birth and death. A man named Pilsen, one of the older farmers in the village, was known for watching the mountain, not as a priest or scholar, but as a listener. He had lived his whole life beneath its shadow. His fields of maize and beans stretched along the lower slopes where the soil was black and rich from centuries of ash. To others, he was quiet and strange. To the mountain, he was faithful. Every morning, before tending his crops, he would walk a short distance uphill, carrying a small clay bowl of incense. There, he would sit on a rock, face the peak, and whisper his greetings. He didn't ask for protection. He simply acknowledged the mountain's presence as one might greet an old friend. That year, though, the smoke thickened. At first it was beautiful, curling into ribbons at sunrise, glowing red at dusk. Then came the tremors, small, sharp vibrations that rattled the maize jars at night and made the chickens restless. In the capital, the priests began to take notice. Messengers were sent to nearby villages collecting reports. Some said the mountain had roared in the night. Others swore they had seen red light flicker from the crater, like fire beneath a pot lid. Still, Pilsen remained calm. He told his neighbors, "It has breathed before. It will breathe again." But he began watching more closely. Each day he marked the mountain's smoke in a small, simple way. A pebble placed on a flat stone outside his hut. White for calm days, black for smoky ones. Over months, the dark pebbles began to outnumber the white. The villagers laughed gently at his collection. But one night, when the tremors grew strong enough to rattle the wooden doors, they came to him and asked what it meant. He said softly, "It means the mountain is remembering something." In Tenochtitlan, far away, the imperial priests performed great ceremonies. Offerings were made to Huehueteotl, the old fire god, and Tlaloc, the lord of rain, asking them to keep the balance. Smoke rose from temple braziers just as it rose from the mountain. To the people below, it was hard to tell which belonged to gods and which to earth. Both fed the sky. Both demanded respect. Tepiltzin, though, knew the mountain in a different way, not as a god, but as a neighbor. He had felt its warmth through the soles of his feet when walking on certain stones. He had seen new cracks open in the earth after rain. He had smelled sulfur on the wind before anyone else noticed. To him, the volcano was alive, yes, but not angry. It was merely full of heat, of memory, of movement. And like all living things, it needed to exhale. One morning, after a night of deep tremors, he climbed higher than usual. The air grew thin, sharp with the scent of minerals and ash. The trees around him were silent. No birds, no insects, just the low hum of the mountain's breath. He sat and watched. A great cloud unfurled from the summit, glowing orange in the sun. It rolled upward like slow thunder. For a moment, he thought he heard something. Not a roar, but a sound like stone grinding against stone, deep and low. He bowed his head. "Old one," he whispered, "if you must breathe, do it gently." That night, ash fell like snow on the village. Soft gray, silent. It coated the roofs, the crops, the water jars. The people swept it away, muttering prayers. Children played in it, laughing until their mothers called them inside. No one panicked. They had seen this before. They trusted the watchers, the priests, and their own patience. But in the capital, panic spread quickly. The priests feared omens, signs of imbalance. Perhaps the anger of gods, perhaps the end of the fifth sun. Messengers came again, asking what the mountain said. Tepiltzin answered only, "It said enough." They didn't understand. They wanted predictions, not wisdom. Yet his answer was the truest one. Mountains do not speak in words. They speak in time. Over the next weeks, the smoke lessened. The tremors eased. Rain returned to the valley. Life went on. Crops grew green again in the blackened soil. The air cleared and the sky turned blue once more. To the city's priests, it was proof that their offerings had worked. To Tepiltzin, it was proof that patience had. And when asked later what he thought of the mountain's silence, he only smiled and said, "It sleeps again." But you should never forget that even mountains dream. Soft background, faint wind, slow crackle, distant rumble. For centuries after, Popocatépetl would breathe on and off, never fully still, never fully wild. And across every generation there were watchers like Tepiltzin, quiet, observant, patient. Farmers, shepherds, villagers who learned to live with the rhythm of the earth instead of against it. Years passed, and the story of the smoking mountain faded into one more thread of Aztec memory. A tale told softly at night, beside the glow of a fire. But for those who lived near Popocatépetl, the watchers remained. Not priests, not soldiers, simple people who noticed things others overlooked. The pattern of cracks in the soil, the smell of wind before rain, the tremor in the walls just before sleep. They had no written records, only memories and rituals. And these were passed down not in temples but around hearths. Always listen to the ground, the old ones would say. The earth speaks more quietly than the gods, but she speaks longer. In the decades after the first great smoking, the valley changed. New rulers rose and fell. The great city of Tenochtitlan expanded. More canals, more gardens, more people. Stone temples stretched higher toward the sun, and yet far to the southeast, Popocatépetl still brooded in its calm way, sometimes silent, sometimes exhaling faint smoke. To most in the capital, it was a distant symbol now, a shape on the horizon. To the villagers below, it was still family. Among those villagers was a young boy named Iotoxtli, Turtle Rabbit, a name given for his slow but curious nature. He lived in a small hamlet on the lower slopes, where maize fields met pine forests. His grandmother, one of the last who remembered Tepiltsin, taught him the old ways of watching the earth. Every morning they would climb a low ridge together. She would point to the mountain and ask, "What do you see today?" He would answer with what seemed like nothing. Smoke faint. Snow less. Birds none. And she would nod. That was enough. Observation was prayer. While others prayed with incense and blood, the watchers prayed with attention. They believed that noticing was a kind of offering, a way to honor the forces that moved the world. To see the small changes before they became large ones, they kept no idols, only small bowls of ash and stone. Their altars were the hills themselves. It was quiet work, often mocked by city priests who thought it dull or superstitious. But when the tremors came again, it was always the watchers who knew first. Iotoxtli grew to love the mountain's moods. He noticed how in certain seasons, the smoke curved east instead of west, a sign his grandmother said of changing winds. He noticed that when the dogs barked toward the mountain at night, rain would follow the next day. He noticed that the ash, when spread thin over maize fields, made the plants grow greener. To him, the mountain wasn't dangerous. It was generous, a teacher that spoke in signs. When he was older, a small temple was built near their village, not to worship the volcano, but to record its patterns. It was one of many such observatories built under imperial order, part of the Aztec effort to understand the balance between the elements. The priests who came were quiet men too, more scholars than mystics. They carried scrolls of deerskin and pigment, filled with careful marks, symbols of smoke, wind, and fire. Iotoxtli, now a young man, began helping them. He carried stones for the walls, fetched water, tended the fire, and always he listened. At night the priests would speak of cycles and of suns that had been born and died, of worlds destroyed by jaguars, wind, and fire. They believed the fifth sun, their own age, would end the same way, by trembling earth. Iotoxtli didn't know if this was true, but he had seen how easily the ground could shake, how the sky could darken with ash. He didn't fear the prophecy. He respected it. For him, the end of a world didn't mean destruction. It meant transformation, one form of life folding quietly into another. In time, Iotoxtli took his grandmother's place as the watcher. She grew old, her hearing faded, her knees stiffened, but she still smiled when he came home with ash on his hands and said, "It's breathing again." She would nod and reply, "Then remember to breathe with it." 1 year, the mountain changed again, not violently but persistently, small tremors each week, streams warming unexpectedly, a faint glow at night like embers beneath a thin layer of cloud. The priests sent messengers to Tenochtitlan, warning of unrest. Sacrifices were made, ceremonies held, the city worried, but in the village Iotoxtli stayed calm. He told his neighbors, "The mountain does not roar without reason. It exhales what we forget to release." They didn't entirely understand, but they trusted him, as their parents had trusted Tepiltsin. One evening, as the sun set behind the twin peaks, Iotoxtli climbed higher than ever before. He carried a torch, a bundle of maize cakes, and a small pot of water. The air grew colder. The ground cracked underfoot. The torch sputtered in the wind. When he reached the ridge, he saw the crater, a dark bowl, pulsing faintly with heat. He placed the food and water on the ground, whispering a simple prayer. For the warmth beneath, for the breath above, for what you take and what you give. Then he sat in silence. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Then from deep within the earth came a sound, low, distant like the heart of the world beating once. And then stillness. He descended slowly, the torch now only embers. When he returned home, his grandmother was waiting, her eyes reflecting the glow of their hearth. She asked, "What did it say?" He smiled faintly. "It said nothing new. But I listened anyway." She laughed softly, a dry, tired laugh full of peace. "That's how you keep the balance, child. Not by answers, but by listening." The tremors eased soon after. The mountain slept again. But in his mind, Ayotoshli carried that deep, wordless hum, the reminder that the world was alive, that even silence spoke. He became the quiet teacher of his village, guiding others in the ways of watching and waiting. Some called him dull, others called him patient. He thought of himself only as someone who noticed. Generations later, when the empire fell and new gods took the altars, the Watchers' traditions faded from memory. But the mountain never forgot them, even today, when Popocatépetl breathes its smoke into the cold morning sky. There are still people, farmers, scientists, wanderers, who stand quietly at its base and listen. They take readings now with instruments instead of pebbles. They write notes instead of stories. But the purpose remains the same: to understand, to respect, to notice. In the end, mountains remember longer than men. The quiet watchers, the priests, even the empire that had once mapped the sky with stone and blood, all would fade into dust. But Popocatépetl would remain, steady and alive, whispering its slow language of smoke and tremor to any who still cared to listen. Centuries slipped past like drifting clouds. The floating gardens turned to ruins, the canals filled with mud, and the city of Tenochtitlan sank into its own reflections. Yet the mountain still stood, white-tipped and patient, overlooking the valley that had once worshipped it. When the strangers came from across the sea, the Watchers were long gone. Ayotartli's descendants had forgotten his name, though the stories lingered in fragments, half-remembered warnings, lullabies about the mountain's moods. To the newcomers, the volcano was both terrifying and magnificent. They called it El Popocatépetl, the smoking mountain. They built their chapels in its shadow, just as the Aztecs had built their temples, and they too prayed for safety when it rumbled, but they did not listen, not in the old way. They looked at the mountain as something to fear or to measure. They mapped its slopes, carved roads into its sides, and dug its stones to build walls. They recorded its eruptions in journals, dates, ash heights, destruction. All data, no reverence. The Watchers had known better. That knowledge without humility was as dangerous as the fire beneath the earth. One chronicler from those early colonial years wrote of a night when the volcano glowed red from within, as though a forge had been lit inside the world. The villagers below fled into the darkness, clutching crosses, whispering that the old gods were angry. But high in the mist, a shepherd boy stayed behind. He watched as sparks rose silently into the stars, then faded, leaving nothing but the steady hum of wind. He could not name what he felt, only that it was not fear. That small act of watching, unrecorded and unnoticed, kept alive a faint echo of Ayotochli's patience. The chain of quiet attention was not entirely broken. Over the next centuries, Popocatépetl became a subject of study. Scientists came with notebooks and compasses, with strange glass lenses and bottles of cooled lava. They described in fine detail what the watchers had once known by instinct: the cycles of eruption, the build of pressure, the signs in smoke and stone. In their own way, they too were listeners, though they called themselves geologists instead of priests. They had replaced ritual with measurement, prayer with observation. But beneath the surface of language, the purpose was the same: to understand without assuming control. One of them, a quiet scholar named Eduardo Molina, spent decades recording the behavior of Popocatépetl from a small wooden cabin halfway up its slope. Locals thought him eccentric but harmless. Each morning he would sit outside with a cup of weak coffee, noting the wind direction and the hue of smoke. He said little, wrote much, and once told a visitor, "The mountain is not dangerous. Impatience is." It was the same truth Ayatoshli had learned centuries before. Popocatépetl's history is not just the story of eruptions. It is a story of relationships. The land around it has always required balance. Too close, and the ash destroys the crops. Too far, and the soil is poor. Farmers for generations learned the rhythm: when to plant, when to rest, when to let the mountain breathe. These were not written rules, but remembered habits passed down through the quiet talk of families. You could call them science or superstition. The truth was they were both. In the modern age, satellites now track Popocatépetl's every breath. Infrared cameras watch for heat. Sensors buried in the soil listen for tremors. The watchers have become a network of machines. Yet every so often, when the mountain rumbles and smoke rolls over the valley, people still stop. They step outside their homes, turn toward the peak, and fall silent. No data, no measuring, just looking. In that stillness, the old watchers live again. The earth speaks, and for a moment everyone listens. There is a story told by elders in a small town near Cholula, perhaps a remnant of the watchers' lore. They say that once every few generations, when the mountain glows red at dusk, a figure appears on its slope. A man of ash and breath holding a torch that never burns out. He does not speak, only stands facing the valley, watching. No one dares approach him. By morning he is gone. The ground is quiet again. Scholars dismiss the tale as folklore, a mix of Aztec myth and Christian legend. But to those who still farm the volcanic soil, it means something simpler. The mountain is not alone. Neither are we. And so life continues beneath Popocatépetl's gaze. Children walk to school under its smoke. Tourists take photos, unaware that the ground beneath them remembers thousands of years of prayers and footsteps. Even the ash that sometimes coats the roofs is swept away calmly, like an old friend returning briefly to say hello. There is peace in this balance, peace earned through generations of quiet observation. The watchers are gone in name, but their spirit endures in every person who still looks up, still listens, still feels that pull of awe mixed with respect. Popocatépetl does not ask for worship nor demand fear. It only asks what it always has: to be noticed. For to notice is to belong. To listen is to remember, and to remember, quietly, patiently, is to keep the world alive. The watchers of Popocatépetl may have vanished into time, but their lesson remains clear and simple. Not all power shouts. Some of it whispers, beneath our feet, in the smoke above us, in the moments we choose to pause and listen. Perhaps that's what the mountain has been saying all along.